group for cycling and walking to welcome Jeremy Vine, who is going to be speaking with Isabel Hardman and Peter Walker about their recent books. So I'm Selene Saxby, I'm the MP for North Devon, and I'm co-chair of the APPG with Ruth Cadbury, who will be closing the meeting. So Jeremy, I'm sure, doesn't really need an introduction, but he's a presenter, broadcaster, and host of BBC Radio 2's Lunchtime Show and is on Channel 5. Isabel is the assistant editor of The Spectator, Week in Westminster presenter, columnist for The Eye and Evening Standard, and the author of Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, which fortunately we're not discussing this evening, and The Natural Health Service, which we are. Peter Walker is the political correspondent at The Guardian and was the author of The Bike Nation, How Cycling Can Save the World, and has been writing about cycling for over a decade. And tonight is talking about his book, The Miracle Pill, and why a sedentary world is getting it all wrong. So we're going to have about 35 minutes of conversation, and then there's a chance for you to ask your own questions. There's a Q&A box. It's a webinar format, so sorry, you can see us, we can't see you. So you type your question in the Q&A box, and we will hopefully get there about 8:10 and try and answer some of those questions for you. Then closing this evening will be Ruth, and you're also all being entered into a virtual raffle, this is my first virtual raffle this evening, so it's another first for Zoom. And so you don't need to do anything, and even better, you don't need to pay, which for politicians, we always know that that's actually the most expensive part of the evening. So no paying tonight, and there's 4 books on offer, and you might get lucky. So do stay to the end so you can claim yours. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy and Peter, and Isabel will be along to talk about hers shortly. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Selene. Thank you so much. And it's a strange one for us here because we can't see you, but we can sort of feel your presence in the audience land. And it's a very warm welcome to you. Thanks to Selene. Ruth will talk a bit later on. I'm actually in West London, in Chiswick here, where the most exciting and difficult news, it seems, for the whole area has been that they actually built a cycle lane. So it's right up our street in a way. There are 2 books at the centre of tonight's event. I'm just going to hold them up. So one of them, this one is called The Miracle Pill by my friend Peter Walker. I'll speak to him first. And The Natural Health Service by Isabel Hardman, which Selene mentioned, they're very, very complementary. If you want me to summarize, this book really is about Isabel's reaching into nature to get better from really a terrible mental health situation she can talk about with us. And this book, we'll start with you, Peter. Well, it's about the joy of exercise, really, isn't it?
Well, less exercise in terms of formal exercise than the kind of everyday movement we have into in our lives. It's what public health experts like to call incidental activity, the stuff you don't even really think about just because it's part of your life, whether it's, walking to work or running up the stairs or digging in your garden or stuff like that. And it's stuff that over the last 50 or 60 years, the population as a whole doesn't really do enough of.
I was amazed reading your book at how little we do. Now, you've got stats coming out of your ears, I know, but the thing about how rarely we even get out of breath, tell us about that.
Well, there's various ones. There's one statistic which is actually, I think it's Department for Transport survey of how often people walk for, I think it's 10 or 15 minutes at a brisk pace, so enough to kind of get the heart rate up. And the average person basically doesn't do it in an average month. Oh, sorry, it's about 20% of people don't do it at all in an average month. So that's a lot of people not walking briskly at all. And the important point to stress here is that this isn't because there's been this kind of mass outbreak of laziness around the world. It's just the world around us has changed. And, a lot of it is kind of tedious stuff you wouldn't want to go back to, like chopping wood for fires and beating rugs and, having to hand wash clothes. But nothing has taken its place. And there's been this government attitude, it's all about personal responsibility. It's all about people doing sport and exercise, but not enough people do that. And the crisis is very real and it's getting bigger all the time.
And when I read your book, I was thinking, gosh, yeah, you've got a point here, because all through my life, I've heard programs like Tomorrow's World. They use the phrase labor saving as if that's, that's the ultimate thing for us. On Amazon the other day, I see there's now a Hoover where vacuum cleaner, you just set it going when you're out and it hoovers the house while you're out. Now that's fine, but we need to replace the activity somehow, don't we?
Well, we do. And I mean, lockdown has really shown us how possible it is to live without really kind of doing much activity at all. You can, rather than walking to cinema, you can just stream a film. rather than even walking to a restaurant. You can just use an app and get a takeaway to your door. And again, this isn't to criticize these kind of things, but there has to be something in its place. And whatever that is depends, what it is for what basically works for every person. I mean, for me, under normal terms, it's cycling to and from work, which, Jeremy, is the same for you. And I do it because it's quicker. It's actually quicker than getting public transport. So it means I don't have to think about exercise. It just becomes part of my life. But for a lot of people, it's very difficult. The world is designed in a way that makes a lot of that stuff quite tricky.
Now, Isabel's here. Hello to you. Is all good at your end?
Hi, Isabel.
I'm so sorry that I'm late.
Not at all.
My son has just gone to sleep. So.
You're not, really not, because we were going to start with Peter laying out his book. I've tried to summarize yours in 30 seconds and failed. So I'll now ask you to tell us what the Natural Health Service is all about.
Great, and you've got the book and I don't, so thank you. So the Natural Health Service is all about the connection between nature and our mental health and outdoor exercise. And so it's quite a personal book in lots of ways, because the reason I wrote it was I discovered while recovering from the sort of acute phase of my own post-traumatic stress disorder, that being outside, that running outdoors, that cold water swimming, that wildflowers and bird watching and so on were a really good way of distracting me from some of the worst thoughts that I was having, and also of managing some of the other symptoms of my PTSD as well. And I realised that there was quite a lot of research behind this, and that other people than just me would benefit from this research being collated. And so I wrote a book and met up with lots of people who use the great outdoors in lots of different ways to manage their conditions, and learned a huge amount, got into a lot of new things actually as a result of the research. So I wasn't a swimmer before I started writing this book, but I'd agreed to write a chapter on swimming, and so I went swimming and discovered it was actually fabulous, and it's made a huge difference to my mental health as well. So it's been good for me as well.
And the word I take from your book, Isabel, the main word is the word orchid delirium. I've now learned that. So you can explain to me what that is.
Yes, my poor editor at Atlantic, Mike, who edited my first book, which is on politics, then found himself having to very politely suggest to me that 73 mentions of orchids in my manuscript might be a tad excessive. And I think I managed to cut that down to about 50 in the end, which felt very parsimonious. But no, wild orchids are my real passion. And they're one of the things that really got me through some of the kind of really dark days of my sick leave. We have 52 different orchids that grow wild in this country. They're not the ones that you have on your windowsill that most of us kill. They're quite a diverse collection of different plants. Some of them are really showy. Some of them are absolutely beautiful. They've got, bright yellow lips and bright red sepals, and some of them are tiny and look like blades of grass. And I've dragged family members on expeditions to look for these bog orchids, and they've been very disappointed at the end of the 4-hour trip to find them.
It's what's amazing, because I didn't know if you'd both read each other's books before you knew you were doing this thing tonight, and they are so complementary. And I think yours, Isabel, is in a way about how nature and the outdoors feeds the brain. And Peter, yours is more about our physical well-being. It's fair to say. You'll probably say it's mental health as well. But the fact that we've almost gone to rack and ruin with all this technology is incredible.
Well, it is. I mean, one of the things that really got me thinking about this book, was the kind of inspiration for the book, was I wrote an earlier book about the case for more kind of everyday cycling as transport. And a chapter in that was about the health consequences of inactive living. And there's a statistic from Public Health England, which basically says that every year there's about 100,000 people across the UK die younger than they should do because of the consequences of inactive living. And these aren't, this isn't a direct thing. It's not like catching something. It's, after 20, 30, 40 years of not exerting yourself, you're more likely to get type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, some types of cancer, the list goes on and on. I mean, you're more likely to get Alzheimer's. Your mental health is also likely to be worse too, but that's the kind of subject I didn't, I cover, but not fully, because it's such a kind of much more complicated thing. But what struck me too is that, the NHS is very, very good at keeping people alive for longer, which is obviously brilliant. But almost the bigger crisis is the fact we have a lot of people living to quite an old age, but their healthy life expectancy is much, much less. So you have a lot of people who are getting these kind of chronic conditions in their 40s or 50s, but living to their 70s or 80s. And apart from the kind of human misery of people not necessarily being able to enjoy their lives in the way they can, I mean, public health experts and doctors who I talk to were quite open about this. They say if we don't sort this, then the NHS, in terms of a kind of free at point of service universal health system, won't be around in like 30 or 40 years. They'll just be overwhelmed.
You tell a story, which I love, about in the 50s, they're trying to work out who has the heart attacks in the bus company. And they work out it's all the drivers and none of the conductors. And they completely mystifies them. And the only thing they can think of is the conductor has to go up 500 steps a day because he's going upstairs and downstairs. And what's amazing about that story is that was a revelation, because at the time, the thinking was, Peter, was it not, that the more you used your heart when you're young, the shorter your life was going to be?
There was this weird thing, because obviously a lot of kind of, doctor sages over the ages would say, being active is good for you. But there was this period, particularly in British medicine, from a kind of Victorian era to maybe the 40s and 50s, where there was this slightly snobbish assumption that if you exerted yourself, particularly in sports, then your heart would be damaged and you'd probably have a kind of shorter life. And so they set this amazing kind of activist doctor, Dr. Jerry Morris, who frankly deserves a book of his own, to work after World War II, because the heart disease rates were going up and up, and they didn't know why. At one point, there was this theory it could be to do with the effect of all the bitumen being like laid on all the roads after World War II. And he studied the transport records of London transport workers. And, as you say, he found that the conductors had half the rates of heart disease than the bus drivers. And this was such a shocking finding, because this was the era when everyone basically wanted a desk job. They wanted to give up their manual work and sit behind a desk. And, normally if you find something out like that in science now, you'd rush it into print. But he spent 3 more years gathering evidence just to make sure he was right. Because when the paper was eventually published in 1953, it caused like a revolution. It was amazing.
Isabel, let me talk a bit about your own situation and how you got into the state that you were in. And I don't want you to say anything you don't want to say, obviously, but you're quite open in your book that, you've got a very high pressure job. You're probably quite tough on yourself. And it all just started to, and there was sort of personal circumstances as well. And everything started to unravel. Is that right?
Yeah. So something really bad happened to me at the start of 2016. And my employer at The Spectator is fantastic. I've worked for them for nearly a decade now. And they've always been great. But when that happened, their immediate response was, "Oh, you should have some compassionate leave, take some time out." My response was, "No, I'm going to work through this because that makes sense, because, that's going to be a great distraction." And it turns out actually that sometimes work is a good distraction, but sometimes when really, really terrible things have happened, you can't overload your mind. And I really regret not taking that compassionate leave, because I don't think I would have avoided having a tough time, but I think I probably would have had the space to work through what was happening, rather than, as we remember in 2016, you had the referendum, had leadership contests, had the murder of Joe Cox. It was not a quiet year, or particularly easy year. And lots of my colleagues in the lobby struggled emotionally that year. But they had sort of stable personal lives. I didn't at the time. And so I managed it in an appalling way. And Jeremy, we were talking about this beforehand, that you noticed in the book that I also talked about how I'm, as an athlete, in very much in inverted commas, I tend to keep running when I have an injury, thinking, oh, it'll probably get better. And that was basically my attitude to my mind. If I just keep going, then things will improve. And it turned out that actually things were going to get a whole lot worse. And by the end of 2016, at the party conferences in October, I couldn't really form sentences. I couldn't write. I was having panic attacks the whole time. I remember turning up at the Tory party conference, sort of looking, I think I looked pretty good. I'd had a haircut, I'd had my nails done, I was wearing lovely crisp white shirt and new leopard print shoes. But all of that did not mask the fact that I was really mentally ill. And I'm sure my colleagues were being very kind to me and looking at me and thinking she's really sick. But within a few days, it was obvious to me that I had to stop, and I had to get emergency treatment and was sedated. And then went on the first of a series of bouts of sick leave, which I've had on and off for 4 years after that. You can hear my dogs in the background. They're also part of my treatment, and also
I know. We can almost do it, because there's a chapter on dogs and cats. There's a chapter on swimming, as you say. There's a chapter, you'll be pleased to know, on cycling, Peter. So
excellent.
There we are again. But did you find, leaving out the recovery element, Isabel, did you find that lots of things in our modern lives were working against you? Someone said to me, we're living 5-screen existences now. So the bombardment is not helpful.
Yeah, we don't have very healthy lives, do we? And I think the interesting thing, that when Peter was just talking about the surprise upon finding the consequences for people's hearts of physical activity, it's quite difficult for us to imagine that, isn't it? That it will be a surprise that it's good for you to be exercising. A lot of people have said to me, you know, why are you writing a book saying that being outdoors is good for you? Surely that's obvious. And my response is, well, I mean, look at our lives. It's not obvious, because actually we spend a lot of our time and money trying to shut all of those things that are good for us out, whether it's through sedentary sort of just spending every evening scrolling on our phones, or trying to shut nature out of building developments, town planning, and so on. We're not living as though we intuitively know that the outdoors is good for us. So that argument needs to be made, and that we need research that backs up what has been for centuries just a hunch. So yes, I think our lives, my life certainly, was not conducive to good mental health. And it's been nearly a year since I had any serious symptoms, and I was recently discharged by the psychiatrist who was treating me, so I'm now just being treated by a GP, and I'm still on very strong antidepressants, but in spite of all of that, I'm still making sure that my weeks are planned around things that help me manage my mental health. So on Monday, for instance, I was working from home, and in my lunch break, instead of eating a coronation chicken sandwich over my keyboard and doing my emails, I went to my allotment and I watered my plants, planted a few things. I was there just for half an hour, came back home, mind was refreshed. You know, I was actually able to concentrate and think far better than had I had that lovely al desco lunch that is so much of a habit that you forget that's not healthy.
I've never heard the phrase al desco before. That's brilliant. I'm going to remember that. Listen, there's a Q&A function on here. You can, just to say to our audience, although we can't see you, you can ask questions, and I'm going to tap on it in a second and see who's asked what, and I'll put them to our brilliant guests here. Peter, I mean, the funny thing, you're both in politics, right? You both work reporting politics. And we've also got, a lot of politicians on the Zoom show here, I nearly said. And I just wonder how you make this real in politics. I mean, I don't want to go on about our cycle lane. Ruth Cadbury is probably as obsessed with it as I am, because it's her constituency. But my God, there's a group of people in this neighbourhood trying to raise £50,000 to take a case to have the cycle lane ripped out. And it might happen. It happened in Kensington. So getting people saying, here's a lane, please start cycling, doesn't work, does it? So what do you do, Peter?
It's a very politically difficult thing for all sorts of reasons. One of the things is that to truly change this, it has to be, just appealing to people's responsibility, which governments have tried for that last 30, 40 years, clearly doesn't work. So you almost need to have this more interventionist, dare I say, nanny state approach to it. And it's politically difficult because partly, as you say, if you try and do something, for example, reallocating road space, even to make it easier for people to walk, then the kickback is enormous. I don't envy any of the councillors who have to do this, because it's incredibly tricky. And I know that a lot of MPs get a lot of kind of input, because people who drive tend to be very, very vocal. That's what lots of people have said to me. People who cycle don't seem to write to their MPs, but people who drive and want to park their cars do. And I mean, I talked to quite a few MPs and various other people and former ministers about why nothing gets done about inactivity. And one of the things is it just cuts across lots of departmental lines. It's not DCMS, it's not health strictly, it cuts across loads. The other one obviously is the timescale. I mean, if you're a 20-year-old and you kind of get a sedentary job and then flop down on your sofa every evening, you won't necessarily feel the health consequences for possibly 30 years. And that's beyond the career of any kind of politician. But the one thing that gives me hope a little bit is that I did quite a lot of the research for the book before the first lockdown. I was writing it during the lockdown. And it was quite funny having talked to epidemiologists before everyone else was talking to them. Suddenly they were everywhere. And I was thinking, when politicians were complaining, saying, oh, voters won't take for the nanny state, I was thinking, well, you've closed down the entire economy of a country. I think the bar for what constitutes nanny state has maybe been, raised a bit. So it would be nice to think in a post-pandemic world, some of that could be taken. You're thinking, well, we've saved, who knows, 200,000 lives through lockdown. But, if it's 100,000 lives a year, that's every year. So why not do more?
Let me see if I tap on my screen, I can have a look at the questions which have come in already. Let's just have a look, and do type on Q&A. That's great. Okay, Christine Wallace is on the call and she says, for Isabel, what do you believe could be done to make the Westminster Whitehall bubble more mental health friendly with the long working hours and the high stress levels?
I mean, it is difficult because Westminster is never going to be a sort of 9 to 5 kind of place. And there have been lots of steps to make it healthier in lots of ways. Not least, actually, I think politicians talking about their mental health. So a really formative moment for me was that debate in 2012 when Charles Walker, Kevin Jones and so on talked about their mental health problems. I think it was particularly powerful that it was 2 men who were the sort of leading voices in that debate. It just made talking about mental health much easier. And so when I got sick, it made it, I wasn't that frightened of saying I was unwell. So I think sort of normalising mental health as a topic for discussion, as something people need to look out for, I think is really important. I have to say, I think there is a sort of celebration of presenteeism and unhealthy living in Westminster. And I don't want to sound like I'm sort of suggesting that everyone just has to eat, I don't know, bean sprouts and stuff, but I'm actually talking to you whilst drinking a G&T, so I'm not going to say teetotal. But I think the alcohol culture in Westminster is not good. It's very normal to have an alcohol problem that goes unnoticed until it becomes sort of, bordering on not functioning. And you talk to any MP and they'll say, oh, so-and-so, yeah, he's got a drink problem. Or is anyone doing anything about it? No, not really. And, they can just pop along to a reception at 3 p.m. and there's free wine. So it's quite easy to develop a very unhealthy lifestyle. I think also the presenteeism, particularly actually amongst special advisors and researchers and so on, who just want to show that they're there till midnight working on this thing, when actually they, no one's going to read this thing that they're working on, or they're not actually working on anything. They're just WhatsApping people about who they hate, and just going home. I find this quite difficult to offer lots of advice on, because I've made a lot of changes in my life as a result of being unwell. So I'm self-employed and I work very flexibly. And I know that's not practical for everyone. But I have, since getting ill, I have written 2 books and I'm writing my 3rd. So it's not as though my productivity's gone down. It's just that I've changed the way I work and live to keep my mind on a sort of balanced level.
But when I was reading your book, Isabel, I was thinking the one thing you need is you really need to commit to these changes. You have to find time actually for your orchids, Yeah. And I don't know where that, Peter, with you, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? People haven't got the time. They think they haven't got the time. The only way I was going to be 15, 16 stone when I was in my mid 40s, unless I found a way of exercising. I joined a gym. I went once in the year I was there, and I used the jacuzzi, and that cost me 500 quid just to use the jacuzzi once. So I thought, I don't know how to do this. And then it just came to me. I'm going to buy a bicycle. I'm going to cycle 75 miles a week to go. That's my commute. And it's changed my life. It's changed my mental health. It's changed everything. And it's a labor, as you say, time saving. Now, until it's time saving, it doesn't happen, Peter. That's the trouble, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. And you basically have to be creative. I mean, the best... when I was talking, I talked to lots of public health experts and other experts whilst researching the book. And at the end of every chat, I usually ask them 2 things. I'd say, first of all, what kind of a desk are you at? And pretty much everyone was at a sit-stand desk and they'd be standing up. And the second thing I'd ask them is, what activity do you do? And a lot of them were, to be fair, having to make time to do it. So they'd make sure that they got up every hour and went for a mini walk or stuff like that. But the best piece of advice I got is from a guy called Professor Stephen Blair, who's this US public health expert who was, very much at the kind of birth of all this. He's been writing papers on it for a long, long time. He's now 84, but he still walks 15,000 steps every day. But his advice on what, I basically said, what's the best activity people should do? And he said, it's whatever you keep on doing. And that's basically it. It completely varies, whatever fits into your life. So it could be something as simple as, I don't know, if you're a Londoner and you commute by tube or by bus, just walk to a slightly different bus stop. It might take you 5 minutes longer, but you can do it. If you do live somewhere where you can cycle, do that. If you've got a garden, spend more time in that, because gardening very, very much crosses a threshold into being moderate physical exertion. So it's extremely good for you. Basically, whatever fits into your life. And there's, that's almost a slightly frustrating thing. There's no simple answer, but once you do find it, it's like cycling with you. Once you find the thing, it's like you've been let in on a secret. It's like magic.
Okay, I've got a question here from Adam Tranter, who I follow on Twitter, and he's brilliant. Adam, I think you're involved with Transport in Coventry. Adam says, before the pandemic, Public Health England had a budget of just £350 million a year and wasn't well known. Then the experts got a seat at the top table, obviously because of COVID, with the daily briefings. Do you think politicians will continue now to listen to public health experts? Because actually they've been advocating this stuff for decades. I'll put that to you, Peter.
You'd hope so. It's a weird world we live in where epidemiologists are kind of household names on, TV prime time, because they're a slightly arcane branch of science for the most part, this kind of study of population-wide health outcomes. No one really used to think about it that much. But it's an incredibly important thing. I mean, this guy, Dr. Jerry Morris, who made the connection between activity and people, living longer, better lives. His whole life was devoted to the study of the fact that we don't live health-wise in a vacuum. We live in this society which, shapes what we are. And it's, often to do with weight too, because, that's a subject I briefly go into in the book. But obviously the factors that affect what people eat and the activity they can do, it's like people are at the bottom of this pyramid, which is kind of weighing down on them. And I don't know. I mean, it almost goes back to what I was saying before, that COVID could potentially have changed things, where people think, well, we've listened to public health experts before, why not now? But there's this alternative answer that people might think, I never want to hear from an epidemiologist again in my life, and that's it. I don't want to see Jonathan Van Damme's face again. So, I mean, it's too early to tell, but I'm slightly optimistic.
Yeah. Well, Isabel, in your book, when you go and you do a proper investigation of all these different sort of remedies, and what's interesting to me is that a lot of them are starting to almost be not quite prescribed, but they exist in an almost official way. Forest bathing in Japan, for example, is a thing, right?
Yeah, it's being prescribed in this country. Park run is something that GPs, they have an official partnership with the Royal College of GPs now, and they prescribe it not just for mental illness, but for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, where patients will benefit from that, even if it's just walking the course. And Park run have been really good at changing their focus from, the sort of stringy men at the front who managed to run 5K in 17 minutes to people who are recovering from heart surgery who walk it in an hour. And that's absolutely fantastic. And I think one of the other things I've seen over the past year is the way certain things that were niche, even when I started researching the book, have started to go mainstream, often to a slightly irritating extent. So cold water swimming, when I started it, everyone was like, why are you doing that? And now it's so trendy that I feel embarrassed admitting I do it, because it's like everyone's got a dry robe, but everyone's swimming in the Serpentine. But really, actually, that's great, because running went through this, a decade or so ago, where you only really ran if you lived in California and, you were good at it. And now it's perfectly normal for someone like me who is not good at running to go and run the London Marathon, and for it just to be part of life. And I find it really encouraging that swimming is moving in that direction. And actually, a lot of the questions are, how do we get politicians to pay more attention to cycling? And I think one of the things is it widening out from it just being the stereotypical lycra lout. And it obviously has, in the experience of those of us who do cycle commute, I see a lot of women at traffic lights now, as opposed to just angry men. And also, having recently had a son, I've spent the past few months looking at all these amazing barrow bikes you can get and child seats and so on. And when it starts to widen out from just one group to it being a mode of transport that, you know, mothers of 5-month-olds are starting to consider, that's when you get a little bit more pressure. My partner used to be an MP, lots of you know him, John Woodcock, and when you were talking about people complaining about parking, he's in the background, he goes, yes, they fucking do. I mean, you know, people in cars are very vocal, but I think another thing we need to think about is just the convenience of the car. Actually, you know, logistically, it is, even before I had a child, I had to plan a bit more to do my 10-mile cycle commute into the Palace of Westminster, just in terms of clothes to take and, you know, making sure I had a hairdryer and so on. And actually I was lucky because when I got to Westminster, there were these guys with machine guns walking around. So there was no one who was going to nick my bike, whereas most people don't have that, and they just have railings outside their workplace and they worry that their bike is going to get stolen. So I think the sort of normalization of an activity in a group who wouldn't be the stereotypical people to access it is really important.
Very practical question from Fleur Anderson, who says, I'm a London MP. I think bike storage is a major issue for encouraging cycling. Lots of people live in flats, as you were saying, Isabel, or shared houses. Peter, they can't store their bikes safely. Do you agree? And how do we do it? How do we increase bike storage and have bike hangers, says Fleur?
Well, this is one of the interesting things, you know, when you look into the whole reason why so few people ride bikes, there's a lot of kind of social inequality aspects to it. And it's one of the reasons why cycling gets slightly stereotyped as this middle class thing, because it's much easier if you live in a house where you've got a kind of side return, you can put it in a shed or something like that. Whereas if you live in a block of flats, you know, if you leave it outside, locked to a lamppost, it's going to be gone within a couple of days. I mean, there's various things you can do. People can get folding bikes and take them up. That's not perfect for everyone. I mean, in the bit of South London where I live, there's quite a few of these bike hanger things are starting to spring up. And I think they're really good. But I think what you need to do is you need to treat it as an incredibly serious thing. I mean, some councils are doing it quite well, some less so. But basically, you have these hangers which takes up one car parking space, which will fit, you know, what, 8 or 10 bikes in, you know, which again shows how much more space efficient bikes are. But some people complain that they've been asking their councils for weeks or months. I know that councils are really, really kind of overstretched. Parking is one of my really kind of most niche subject areas, but parking is an incredibly subsidized thing. And it's this massive giveaway at a very, very cheap price of public land to store a consumer good. You know, no one else gets that privilege. And I think there should be a much more of a push to kind of be proactive about that. So maybe have a rule that, like, I don't know, every 10th car parking space now has to be a bike space or something like that. But you have to really, really think about what are the barriers to it. And it's not just, you know, as the questioner goes, it's not just the safety aspect, but it's also the stuff about, you know, how do you get into work and stuff like that. I mean, the biggest revolution for me, I used to cycle into the Guardian offices, which was about 6 miles away from where I lived at the time. And I would don the full lycra gimp suit and, you know, take a change of clothes with me and cycle in and have a shower when I got there. But when I moved to working in Westminster, my commute was only about 3 miles. So I got a sensible bike with like a massive basket at the front. I can put my bag in and, you know, full mud guards and chain guards. And on my way there, I cycle in work clothes, you know, whatever the weather. And I go at a reasonably sedate place. I don't get sweaty. I don't need a shower. And, you know, certainly in the press area, the showers at Westminster are really not very pleasant.
The ladies' showers are much nicer, but when they broke, I refused to cycling because there was no way I was using that unisex one. It's disgusting.
It's really, really grim. Anyway, yes, this is even more niche. But all this stuff has to be kind of thought about. And I think there is still this idea that everybody has to have a shower and a change of clothes. And obviously, if you're cycling 10 miles, then that's possible. But a lot of people, it's perfectly easy. If you get an e-bike too, you know, an electric assist bike, you're not going to be sweaty when you get into work. So people should think about that. But then the corollary of that is that they're quite expensive and quite nickable. So workplaces at least need security. You know, it's quite complicated. I'm
searching my conscience at the moment because it's the way that once cycling is mentioned, everything goes to cycling. I hope I haven't done this because Isabel, cycling is 5% of your books. I don't, but it's funny, isn't it? Maybe it's just the totemic issue. Just on your natural health service, I mean, to pay you a compliment here in a bit of a clumsy way, Isabel, I think you were brilliant to write about taking antidepressants because what we've seen with a lot of these books, that people write about their mental health experiences, is they say they did it all themselves, and they used mindfulness or whatever. And then someone says, "Oh, did you use medication? Did you use the doctor or whatever?" And then it comes out slightly reluctantly that they did. But you've been very honest that you've used all the tools available. Yeah,
I mean, I think these interventions should be part of medicine, not an alternative to them. And I do not. I mean, having tried other antidepressants which did not work, I know that the sertraline I take does work and does make a huge difference. I also think it's really important to be clear that a lot of people are not going to be cured by exercise. So a lot of the people who I interviewed for the book, I'd say about 4 or 5 of them have been sectioned since I interviewed them. And that doesn't mean that the interventions they've been using, whether it's running or botany or bird watching, aren't any good. It's just that their illnesses are horrendous and really cunning. And if going for a walk solved mental illness, then we'd all be doing that. But it does make a big difference to managing those symptoms. And I think it's just important to be honest about how far that can take you. It's important to be honest about how far antipsychotics can take you and the side effects of those as well. It's just about being honest rather than suggesting that I found this miracle cure of looking at orchids, great as they are.
Yeah, but I've seen research that says that at a low level, the kind of things that you're talking about, the exercise and so on, are as effective as medication. But unfortunately, the easiest thing is to prescribe the medication if you're a medic.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues that GPs have had for a very long time, is that they only have 10-minute appointments. I had a GP actually who made me book double appointments so that she would spend enough time drilling into whether I was actually getting out of the house when I was really depressed. But not all GPs have that luxury or that inclination. I think that is changing now that we have the social prescribing network that the government is setting up, and we've got the pilots in various parts of the country. Because a lot of the social prescribers aren't GPs. They're people who the GPs signpost their patients to within a practice. And so the GP isn't sitting there going, "Oh, I wonder whether park run or whether, outdoor yoga or something would suit you." You get a social prescriber whose job it is to know what's available locally, and who can take that burden off the GP actually, and work out whether it's that someone's lonely or whether they're not active, and tailor a prescription to that person. And then they're less likely to come back regularly as well.
Okay, we have a question here from Darren Henry, MP, who says to Peter, I cycled to work when I was young. That was the norm. When we had children, I drove them to school. That was the norm. How do we reverse the norm? That's probably the most important question of all, isn't it, Peter?
I mean, the way we do it, it's not kind of rocket science, in a sense that the secrets to how you do it are just across the North Sea. I mean, the Dutch and the Danes, to a lesser extent the Germans, and even the French are starting to do it, managed to have cycling modal shares of all transport of 20-30%. And it's quite boring and takes quite a long time, but it just involves changing your built infrastructure such that cycling is not only safe, because in many ways it is actually quite safe now. The chances of having a serious crash on a bike are relatively low, but so it's obviously safe. So someone who isn't, like me, doesn't have lycra garments and opinions about kind of gear ratio, someone who's just like a normal person can get on a bike and treat it as an extended form of walking that just gets you there quicker. But it just takes time. I mean, I can remember when I was researching the last book, I asked the head of the Dutch Cycling Union, if you were a British politician, what would you do? And she said something like, I'd start in 1972, so.
Great. And I see we have Ruth Cadbury with us. I know you've been here already, but you've now popped up visually. So you can ask a question, Ruth, if you want. Or are you just spectating? Are you muted?
My instructions were to close the event. I have.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Only because you appeared visually. I suddenly thought.
I'm sorry. I started off in a residents' meeting, and then I have to admit I had my dinner because I was starving.
No, don't worry. I didn't want to
so that's the only reason I put my camera on now, just so you didn't think I wasn't here at all.
No, not at all. We can't see the audience. You would have got away with that completely if you hadn't said it. I just thought maybe you want to ask a question. But yeah, I will come to you to close it in due course in 15 minutes or so. But we've got questions coming in. So let's just have a look here. Susan Clark is talking about more walking. And again, I'll read a few out here. How do we ensure that government policy and the media devote as much more attention to walking as they do to cycling? Okay, actually, that's interesting, because people who love to walk, you could comment on this, Isabel, get really cheesed off that cycling is the big story now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think obviously for a lot of people, walking is much more accessible, not just in terms of kit, but in terms of the sort of the thought of doing it than cycling or running. You know, and that's one of the reasons why Park Runner now say you can walk, jog, or run our courses, because for a lot of people, the thought of running is just, you know, it's just too far. And getting someone to go for a walk every day is great. I mean, I don't think we have the same sort of challenges for pedestrians as we do for cyclists, in that, I mean, there are pavements where in London, maybe not in sort of rural areas, but you know, with the low traffic neighbourhoods and cycling routes, that's where it's become politicised, as opposed to just pedestrians being able to get around.
Let me put a question to you which comes from Tonia Antoniazzi, who I'm sure you know, and this is a great question from Tonia. I worry, she says, about the mental health of my staff as an MP. I provide them with additional support and flexible hours, and what you're both saying is great. But how can I encourage them to look at alternative ways to help themselves?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm a big fan of Tonia as well, so thanks for that question. I think modelling stuff to your staff is really important as well, and doing things slightly differently. So my job interview at The Spectator was actually a walk around St James's Park with Fraser Nelson, and I'm certain we covered more ground, but it was actually also just nice. And going for walking meetings, or having meetings outside, or discouraging people from having the al desco lunch, just little things like that, I think are really important. And your staff will copy you as well, because they'll look up to you. So if you're sort of crouched into your desk getting angry with your computer, then they'll learn that that's the way of looking after, or not looking after, yourself at work. Yeah, I think it's just making those sort of opportunities available. You can't force people to adopt mentally healthy lifestyles, but showing them the way is a better way of doing it.
What's interesting is that some people have taken your ideas to extremes, and you point out that in 2018, internal flight in Orlando, they had to boot off an emotional support squirrel that was brought on by a passenger. Is that right?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun researching the emotional support animals section of the book, because I didn't want to suggest that every single thing about animals in the outdoors is great, because there are some absolutely ridiculous things. And the emotional support animals of, you know, there was an emotional support peacock, there was a miniature horse. My favourite one was the kangaroo that someone took on a flight. I was laughing so much at this that my dog actually came up to check that I was okay, because he thought I was in pain. But the problem with emotional support animals, just to sort of be serious about this briefly, is that they're completely unregulated. So unlike guide dogs or registered assistance dogs, you don't, or you can't, I mean, you can't train a peacock. You can't train it that it only defecates when you take its harness off, like you do with a guide dog. You can't train a kangaroo, as far as I'm aware, to sit quietly in the corner. So it gives the real assistance dog a really bad name, because landlords, airlines, public spaces start to distrust your claim that this is an assistance animal, when actually it's gone through 3 years of training, and so on. But also, just for the individual who has spent $50 to register their emotional support, capybara or whatever they've decided is going to help them, actually there can be a way of kind of shutting someone off from the outside world, or from the opportunity to deal with the fear of flying or other issues that they have. I think something that we really struggle with in our society at the moment is accepting that mental health problems, I'm trying to think of I'll speak about this in a sort of personal way because I think it makes it sound less heartless. I don't want to struggle with the PTSD triggers that I have for the rest of my life. And so I find a lot of the talk about, I find this triggering or safe spaces, I find that very difficult to listen to, because for me, some of my triggers are things like going into a supermarket, because they remind me of very traumatic times. Now, I don't want to go through my entire life saying, oh, I find supermarkets triggering, so I'm never going to go to Waitrose again. Actually, part of my treatment was learning to deal with those triggers so that I could live more of a normal life. And I'm not sure that an emotional support peacock is the thing that's going to help you deal with those triggers. Yeah. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps my fourth book will be on the power of peacocks. I don't know, but I think it's important to look at how interventions can get in the way. And I think cycling and running can be a problem as well. You can become obsessed with things. Obviously, eating disorders are an example of when you can use exercise to your mental detriment as opposed to help your mental health. So it's always about making sure that it's helping you rather than becoming part of your illness.
Peter, a bit of your personal stories in the book, and it is very interesting, where you say you were just almost accidentally, to earn some money, you became a courier cyclist, and it was completely revolutionary.
Well, it was. I got into my kind of early 20s, and like a lot of people, I'd done sports as a kid. I had asthma quite badly, so I was by no means sporty or any good at any sports. But it kind of gradually ebbed away from my life in my teenage years, which happens to a lot of people. So by my early 20s, I was doing this astonishingly dull but very secure graduate job, sat at a desk. I wasn't really doing any other activity whatsoever, and I could have been set on that course. And I decided, I can't quite even work out why I decided to do it. I think it was just to give a shock to my life, to become a cycle courier, which in those days you could actually make a reasonable living from, not the first few months, you have to learn the trade. So I went from basically doing nothing to cycling, 50 or 60 miles a day every day. And, when you're young, when you're in your early 20s, your body is very, very easily adaptable to stuff like that. But the biggest change was in my mental attitude. I'd kind of grown up as this kind of scrawny asthma sufferer, thinking, that my body wasn't really something that kind of served me that well. And suddenly, I wouldn't recommend this for, other people, but relying on it to basically pay your rent and realizing it can do it, it completely transformed my mental attitude, made me kind of cherish it. And it's weird. I sometimes still get that kind of rush of feeling. I might be, just cycling somewhere and just cycling over a slight incline on a bridge. And I'll stand up in the pedals and really go for it. And it flashes through my mind, I'm not always going to be able to do this. And it's this joy, it's almost this kind of fundamental of what it is to be human, to use your body in whatever way it was designed for, basically.
Now, we're just after 8:15, and Adam Kaufman, who's brilliantly organized the whole event, is there looking at questions. And I want to make sure I don't miss out any important questions. So Adam, tell me what we've got.
I got a good question from Chris Boardman. Can you
Chris
see that
Boardman,
one?
Go ahead.
Okay. Chris says, we have a world-class product that people don't buy. How do we sell it to the everyday person and make it desirable rather than just practical?
And I'm going to assume that he's talking about basically active travel there, Peter.
On the assumption that he is, how do you sell it? Isabel's point was really interesting, this idea of some people looking at cycling and seeing it as, being this preserve of these kind of like hobbyists, these, as you say, angry middle-aged men. And it's almost a slightly circular argument, but you almost, I think, need to create the infrastructure, and then people come, and then it becomes normalized gradually. And, even in the same way that cycling is treated in the media, it's almost like this kind of, not prejudice, because, it's a very, very disparate group, but it's this kind of acceptable kind of target to a bash. And I think all that needs, people, sometimes say, what can you do about the media? So just cycling has to become more normal. In the same way that 10 years ago, people would joke about like vegans, as a kind of routine thing. But now if you joke about vegans, then it's very possible the person you're joking to, their son or daughter will be. It's very normal, so people don't do it. And cycling needs that. This is cycling and walking, and I know this is Chris's job. I think it's just to present it as being the obvious thing to do. I'm actually going to answer Chris's question, I'm going to quote back to him a quote he gave me when I was talking to him. Because he's the Greater Manchester kind of commissioner for cycling and walking. And he was basically saying he wants to have people in their cars stuck in a traffic jam, looking out their window, looking at cyclists going past and think, oh, actually, that looks better. And that's kind of what you need to do. It has to be something which is obvious. You just think, well, why wouldn't I do it? And, you know, as to how you do it, it's a kind of long and painstaking process with many, many different steps. But that's the kind of ultimate thing. It has to be not a kind of hobby or a choice, but just something that's obvious.
Yeah, they look out their car windows and they think, I'm in this jam because he's on his bicycle. That's the bizarre logic. Adam, give us another.
Okay, we got a question from Lillian Greenwood MP. The question is, where are the low-income working class voices in this debate? Not literally tonight, but generally. Cycling and walking are relatively low cost and accessible, but are we including the communities which could benefit most?
Let me put that to Isabel, because I feel like we're drifting all into cycling, which as I say, is 1/10 of Isabel's book. But anyway, you answer that, Isabel.
Oh, it's such an important question, and I'm devastated that you don't notice my working class roots from my broad accent. But yeah, I think it is really important, and I think one of the issues with all of these activities, and I'm definitely guilty of this, is that, and this relates to the previous question, is that people who get really into it get really obsessed with the kit. And one of my friends who I go swimming with told me recently that I'm like a dad because I've got all the swimming kit, which I actually took as a massive compliment. But not everyone wants or can afford to buy the kit. And most of the time you don't need the kit. So as a cyclist, I mean, I do have quite a few bikes, but I don't really, I find the kit discussion really off-putting, and it's a very sort of masculine middle class thing. And I tend to take my bike to someone to be serviced and just say, just do whatever you need to with it. So I think making sure that the kit doesn't become sort of part of the culture of a hobby to the extent that people feel they have to buy it or to kind of have membership, I think is really important. And I think just to go back to Parkrun, they have been excellent at this. So initially, when they were set up, they were just springing up organically in middle class communities with people who were already runners, who already had the kit. And I remember going to Fulham Palace Parkrun and hearing women talking about how they'd got a discount on their £70 running tights and thinking, bloody hell, I don't fit in here. Like, who, you know, there's so many people who feel excluded by this. But they then made a conscious decision to extend into deprived communities, and they even now have parkruns in prisons. And my local parkrun, when I lived in southwest London, started collecting clothes for a parkrun that was held, I think it was actually Felton Parkrun. I think it was definitely near the Young Offenders Institution, and they were collecting clothes so that kids could do parkrun and not feel self-conscious, and that they actually had clothes to do it. And I think those kinds of things, actually people who are already within the community thinking, well, sure, it's, you know, it's hilarious to joke about N+1 in terms of the number of bikes you need and so on. But actually, wouldn't it be great to talk about how we could help other people get their first bike, or, you know, get their first waterproof coat so that they could cycle, commute and so on. And just thinking about how to welcome people in rather than making it a little exclusive club where we talk about things that other people don't understand, including the dad kit.
And I'm conscious that some of this can sound very London, where there are amazing efforts underway to get segregated space and all that, Peter. And Selene is MP in North Devon. It's a non-starter in lots of places there. You're going to have a country road and there's going to be one lane, if that, and you're going to have to take your chances.
I mean, that's the thing, that people think that cycling in London is quite dangerous, but it's actually much safer than most parts of the country, just because the traffic is really not very, very fast. Yeah. And if I ever cycle on a country lane, I feel much, much more at risk. I mean, there's two answers to it. One of it partly can be done, you know, to go back to the Dutch again. Quite a lot of their semi-rural roads have got a two-way cycle lane or cycle lanes on both sides, which are completely separated by a verge, so people can do it. Because you know, a lot of rural journeys are quite long, but some of them might only be kind of 2 or 3 miles to get to the nearest village or nearest town. So that can be done by bike. E-bikes are a really, really big thing if you live in a kind of, I don't know, hilly Devon countryside. And they're an amazing thing. You know, they're public health experts say they're one of the best kind of interventions that there's been in like recent years. But you just have to accept the fact it's not going to work for everyone. But the whole point, you know, whenever you get into a debate about the bikes, there's always someone who says, but, you know, what about my 86-year-old great granny who has to drive 120 miles? Then you say, well, it's not about her. It's about the person who's an able-bodied one-person trip driving 3/4 of a mile in a city or a town. You don't want to get everybody out of cars. You just have to get the kind of journeys which could be done in a easier way or better way off the roads, and that suddenly frees more space for everyone else, including the people who do need to drive. You know, it's this whole kind of annoying war on the motorists stuff, which gets incredibly tiresome. But it's just about making life better for everyone, really.
Yeah, people who cycle around filming everything. I know it's terrible.
With their flashy 360-degree cameras.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, I'm so grateful. I'm going to hand over to Ruth in a second, but I mean, it's good that we talked a lot about cycling because this is the All-Party Cycling Committee. There's Peter's book, The Miracle Pill, brilliant, about, you know, just how little exercise we get, and there's Isabel's, which is about very personal, about recovering from mental illness partly with the help of natural remedies. How about that? And thank you both so much. Lovely to talk. Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, massive thanks to my loyal constituent, Jeremy, for a wonderful job of sharing. It's probably a bit too formal term today, but thank you for making it such a lovely event. Thank you to Peter and Isabel for opening up, because I think it's really, really important that people talk about mental health, their own journey of illness, because, and I think there has been a sea change in the last year or two, and what you've done today and what you're doing generally, both of you, with your books and with your speaking engagements, I think really helps that. So thank you, and thank you for your honesty today. You know, we are the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Cycling and Walking, so we did more from health, mental health, to cycling and walking, as it was inevitable. I'm somebody who my middle class exercise kick is actually running. For me, the bike is the quickest way to get around West London, to be honest. And I, you know, so I'm generally cycling in normal clothes. So I may yet, once I stop marathon running, I may yet get into the middle class cycling bit. But I think the really, really important debate is about, you know, the one that Darren Henry asked, and also Lillian, is about changing the norms. And as Peter said, the Netherlands didn't change overnight. I don't know if anybody's pulled this out, but I assume there was resistance to the shift.
Yes.
You know, it started because of a combination of the oil prices and children being killed on the roads. But you know, there will have been resistance to the loss of road space. But in those countries, in those cities that are so much better than us, actually traffic flows more freely. So how do most of us who use cars for too many of our journeys change, if not all of our journeys, at least some of our journeys? And as I say, I have, just because it's quicker and cheaper. And you know, we talk about rural areas, but let's remember, you know, even Solaine's area includes towns with people living in those towns who drive when they could be using active travel, and so on. And Lillian's point about ordinary people, I think I see quite a lot of working class ethnic minority men cycling, but not so many white British men and women and children. So we really do have a cultural barrier here. But actually, there's a very high percentage of UK families that actually do have bikes in their back shed, often rusting. And a lot of them did start getting them out during the tightest lockdown. And some of them have continued to cycle since. particularly where they've got a safe cycle space. So, you know, I hope we're at the beginning of a journey. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of this government, as most people won't be surprised to hear. But the one thing they did get right is the initiative to change legislation and provide funding to get local authorities kick-started on the route. And all the evidence about the resistance, which Jeremy and I know to our cost in Chiswick, is loud but small in number. And when anybody has enough money to do true random sample surveys or door-to-door surveys, I think we understand the picture is very different. And of course, Jeremy and I have had no pushback when we've asked, what about removing the old low traffic neighbourhoods that have been there for 10, 20 or even longer, and you get a deafening silence from that. So I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to be talking too much at this point, but what I am supposed to be doing is my instructions from Adam is announcing the 4 winners of the signed books, which you had an online random name picker. The 2 winners of Isabel's book are Matthew Lowing and Mark Golder, and the 2 winners of Peter's book are Dom Cotton and Darren Henry MP. So congratulations to those. And thank you so much for everybody. We've had almost 50 attendees, so that's been brilliant. And thank you to Adam and everyone else behind the scenes who's been involved with the logistics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.